Welcome to Bedtime Express, your destination for peaceful journeys into sleep through the power of storytelling. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey to ancient Greece, where the Mediterranean breeze carries stories of heroes and redemption. Before you fall asleep, please like this video and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more restful adventures. We also want to know from which part of the world you are joining our peaceful journey, so write your location and time in the comments. Our tale begins not with triumph, but with a man burdened by mistakes, seeking a path toward forgiveness. His name was Heracles, and though blessed with extraordinary strength, he carried an even more extraordinary weight, the weight of his past. Heracles sat beneath an ancient olive tree, its silver leaves whispering secrets in the evening air. The great hero, whose muscles could move mountains, found himself unable to lift the heaviness in his heart. In a moment of madness sent by jealous gods, he had lost what mattered most to him, and now he sought not glory, but redemption. The oracle at Delphi had spoken. 12 labors would cleanse his soul, 12 challenges that would teach him not just about strength, but about patience, wisdom, and the true meaning of heroism. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Heracles rose slowly, his calloused hands brushing dirt from his simple tunic. He had worn the skin of the Nemean lion for so long that people forgot he was, beneath it all, simply a man trying to find his way home to himself. Tonight, we follow him on this journey, not as witnesses to violence, but as companions in the gentle art of transformation. Now make yourself comfortable, dim the lights, and let your breathing slow. Allow the gentle sounds of antiquity to wash over you as we travel back to the very dawn of human civilization. Close your eyes, relax your body, and prepare to drift into the peaceful sleep. All aboard the Bedtime Express. Let the journey begin now. The 12 Labors of Heracles, Strength, Perseverance, and the Journey to Redemption. The morning mist clung to the hills of Nemean like a soft blanket, and Heracles walked through it with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had learned that rushing towards challenges often meant missing their deeper lessons. The villagers had told him of the lion not with excitement, but with the weary sadness of people who had lived too long with fear. Children no longer played in the olive groves. Shepherds kept their flocks close to home. The great beast had become a shadow that darkened every sunrise. But as Heracles climbed the gentle slopes toward the lion's cave, he thought not of the creature's terrible claws or impenetrable hide. Instead, he remembered his own fears, the fear of his own strength, the fear of losing control, the fear that redemption might be impossible. The lion, he realized, was not so different from the fears that prowled in the caves of his own heart. The cave opened before him like a great mouth, and from its depths came a sound that was part roar, part sigh, the voice of something that had been alone for too long. Heracles paused at the entrance, and in that moment of stillness, he understood something profound. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to sit with it, to understand it, to offer it the same compassion he hoped to find for himself. "Great lion," he called softly into the darkness, his voice echoing gently off the stone walls. "I know what it is to be feared, to be alone with your own strength. I know what it is to hurt others without meaning to. Perhaps we are not so different, you and I." The lion emerged slowly, magnificently, its golden coat catching the filtered sunlight like liquid amber. Its eyes held not rage, but a deep, ancient sadness. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other, two creatures who had forgotten how to be gentle. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but rather a dance of understanding. Heracles moved with careful respect, never striking in anger, never forgetting that this great cat was also a child of the earth, deserving of dignity even in its passing. When the lion finally lay still, Heracles knelt beside it and whispered a prayer of gratitude and sorrow. As he fashioned the lion's hide into a cloak, not as a trophy but as a reminder, Heracles felt something shift within him. The first labor was complete, but more importantly, the first lesson had been learned. True strength lay not in conquering fear, but in approaching it with wisdom and compassion. The children of Nemean would play in the olive groves again, but they would also remember to honor the wildness that lived in the world and in themselves. That night, as Heracles slept under the stars, the lion's spirit visited his dreams, no longer fierce but gentle, like a cat curling up by a warm hearth. "Thank you," it seemed to purr, "for seeing me not as a monster, but as a creature who had forgotten how to be at peace." The marshlands of Lerna lay in the early morning like a vast mirror, reflecting clouds and possibilities in equal measure. Heracles approached slowly, his feet making soft, squelching sounds in the rich, dark mud. The air was thick with the scent of growing things, reeds and water lilies, fish and frogs, a reminder that even in places of challenge, life persisted. His nephew Iolaus walked beside him, young and eager, carrying torches and hopes for quick victory. But Heracles had learned something in Nemean about the nature of lasting change. "Patience, young one," he said gently, watching a heron step carefully through the shallows. "Some battles are won not with single strokes, but with steady persistence and the wisdom to ask for help." The Hydra's lair was a tangle of ancient roots and stagnant pools, and from it came not roars, but a strange, multi-layered whispering 9 voices, speaking at once, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in discord. It was the sound of a mind divided against itself, of thoughts that multiplied faster than they could be resolved. When the great serpent emerged, Heracles saw in its many heads the familiar pattern of his own internal struggles. How many times had he cut down one destructive thought, only to have two more spring up in its place? How often had anger begotten more anger, fear bred more fear? The Hydra, he understood, was not just a monster to be defeated, but a teacher of the most important lesson of all. Some problems cannot be solved alone, and some require not just strength, but patience and strategy. Iolaus, he called softly to his nephew, this is not a task for sword alone. When I cut away what is harmful, you must be ready to heal the wound with fire, to prevent the old patterns from returning. Are you ready to help me transform struggle into wisdom? The young man nodded, understanding not just the mechanics of the task, but its deeper meaning. Together, uncle and nephew began the delicate work of change Heracles, cutting away each head with careful precision, Iolaus sealing each wound with purifying flame. It was slow work, requiring not just courage but trust, not just individual strength, but the recognition that lasting transformation often requires community. As each head fell and was cauterized, the remaining voices of the Hydra grew gentler, less chaotic. The serpent was not being destroyed, Heracles realized, but simplified, returned to its essential nature. By the time only one head remained, its voice was clear and peaceful, speaking words of ancient wisdom about the cycles of growth and change. Thank you, the final head whispered before it too transformed, dissolving into golden light that scattered across the marsh like fireflies. You have taught me that multiplication without purpose is chaos, but focused energy can create miracles. As they walked home through the evening marsh, Iolaus looked up at his uncle with new understanding. It wasn't really about killing the Hydra, was it? He asked softly. Heracles smiled, watching the first stars reflect in the still water. No, young one. It was about learning that some challenges require us to work together, with patience and care, to transform chaos into peace. The Hydra still lives in these waters, but now it helps things grow instead of hindering them. That night, as they camped by the marsh's edge, they could hear gentle splashing in the darkness, the sound of the transformed Hydra, now a guardian of the wetlands, helping lost travelers find their way and tending to injured water birds with infinite, patient care. For an entire year, Heracles had been following the golden hind through forests and meadows, over mountains and across streams. But this was not a hunt in any traditional sense. It was more like a meditation in motion, a slow dance of patience and respect. The sacred deer of Artemis ran not from fear but from an ancient joy, her bronze hooves barely touching the earth, her golden antlers catching sunlight like a crown of stars. In the early days of the chase, Heracles had tried to capture her with speed and strategy, setting traps and attempting to corner her in narrow valleys. But the Hind had taught him, through her gentle evasion, that some treasures cannot be grasped, they can only be received. She led him not away from his destination, but toward it, through landscapes of incredible beauty that he might otherwise have missed in his haste to complete his labors. Through the changing seasons, Heracles learned to match the Hind's rhythm, to move with the same unhurried grace. In spring they ran through meadows bright with wild flowers, the deer pausing sometimes to let him catch sight of her, always staying just close enough to keep hope alive. In summer she led him to hidden groves where ancient trees offered shade and cool streams provided rest. In autumn, their path wound through orchards heavy with fruit, where she would stop to eat, allowing him to appreciate the simple pleasure of sustenance. Winter brought the deepest teaching of all. As snow began to fall, the Hind slowed her pace, no longer running but walking, as if inviting Heracles to walk beside her rather than behind. On a morning when the world was crystalline with frost, she finally stopped in a clearing where the first crocuses were pushing up through the snow, a reminder that even in the depths of challenge, new growth was always beginning. "Beautiful one," Heracles said softly, approaching with empty hands and an open heart. "I understand now that you were never meant to be captured, but to teach. You have shown me that patience is not passive waiting, but active appreciation of the journey itself. You have taught me to see the sacred in the everyday, the miraculous in the mundane." The Hind turned to face him fully, her dark eyes holding depths of wisdom accumulated over centuries of running through the world's wild places. Without fear, she stepped forward, allowing him to touch her golden fur, to feel the warm reality of magic. In that touch, Heracles felt a profound connection not just to this creature, but to all the wild, untamable things in the world that required not conquest but reverence. Then, as gently as she had stopped, the Hind stepped back and bounded away, not in flight but in celebration, her joy infectious, filling the clearing with golden light. Heracles understood that he had not failed to capture her. He had succeeded in something far more valuable. He had learned to appreciate beauty without possessing it, to love without controlling, to achieve without conquering. As he made his way back to report to King Eurystheus, Heracles carried with him not a physical trophy, but something far more precious, the memory of a year spent learning to move through the world with grace and patience. The Hind had taught him that some of life's greatest treasures come not from taking, but from the willingness to receive whatever gifts the world offers in its own perfect timing. Years later, travelers in those forests would report glimpses of golden light moving between the trees, and the legend grew that the sacred Hind still ran those paths, forever free, forever beautiful, forever teaching those who had eyes to see that the chase itself could be a form of prayer. The snow-covered peaks of Mount Erymanthos rose before Heracles like ancient temples touching the sky, their surfaces painted silver and blue in the early morning light. The great boar that lived somewhere in these heights had been terrorizing the countryside below, but as Heracles climbed the winding mountain paths, he found himself thinking less about the creature and more about the nature of wildness itself. His footsteps crunched softly in the snow, each step deliberate and mindful. The thin mountain air required slower breathing, deeper presence, and in this enforced contemplation, Heracles began to understand that this labor would teach him something different from the others. The boar was not evil, merely wild, and wildness, he was beginning to learn, was not something to be destroyed, but something to be understood and, when necessary, gently redirected. As he climbed higher, Heracles encountered the boar's path, not the random destruction he had expected, but clear trails through the snow, carefully avoided trees, signs of a creature that moved through its environment with purpose and intelligence. The damage below, he realized, might not have been malicious, but simply the result of a wild thing forced out of its natural habitat, seeking food in places where humans had settled. Near the summit, he found the boar itself, magnificent and powerful, its tusks gleaming like ivory daggers, its bristles thick with frost. But the creature was not rampaging. It was standing quietly in a small grove of pine trees, its breath visible in small clouds, its eyes alert but not aggressive. It was, Heracles realized, simply trying to live its life in the only way it knew how. "Great One," Heracles called softly, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "I have not come to harm you, but to understand you. The people below are afraid, but fear often comes from lack of understanding. Perhaps we can find a way for you to live freely without bringing harm to others." The boar turned its massive head toward him, its small, intelligent eyes studying this strange human who spoke to it with respect rather than aggression. Slowly, carefully, Heracles began to circle the grove, not as a hunter but as a gentle shepherd, his movements calculated to guide rather than threaten. He had learned from the Hind about patience, and now he applied that lesson to the art of gentle persuasion. Using the natural contours of the mountain, Heracles gradually guided the boar toward a deep snowdrift he had noticed earlier. The creature, sensing no immediate threat, followed the path of least resistance, and when it stepped into the deep snow, it found itself gently but securely trapped, not harmed but immobilized. "Forgive me, friend," Heracles said as he carefully secured the boar for transport. "But sometimes we must be temporarily constrained in order to find our true freedom." The boar's struggles were brief and half-hearted, as if it understood that this human meant no real harm. The journey down the mountain was slow and careful, with Heracles stopping frequently to ensure the boar was comfortable and unharmed. He spoke to it constantly, explaining his plan, sharing his thoughts about the nature of wildness and civilization, about the possibility of coexistence. By the time they reached the foothills, the boar had grown calm, seeming to understand that this was not captivity, but relocation. Instead of delivering the boar to King Eurystheus as a trophy, Heracles took it to a vast, uninhabited valley he had noticed during his travels, a place where it could live freely without encountering human settlements. As he released the great creature, the boar turned back once, as if in acknowledgement, before disappearing into its new home. The villagers below never saw the boar again, but they did report something wonderful. Sightings of wild pigs in the distant valley, healthy and thriving, living proof that wildness and civilization could coexist when approached with wisdom and compassion rather than fear and aggression. That night, as Heracles camped under the stars, he reflected on the day's lesson. True strength sometimes meant not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to redirect, not the power to conquer, but the gentleness to guide creatures and situations toward their highest good. The stables of King Augean stretched across the valley like a small city, their walls high and strong, built to house 1,000 immortal cattle. But as Heracles approached, the sight that greeted him was not one of pastoral beauty, but of overwhelming neglect. 30 years of accumulated waste had created not just a mess, but an entirely transformed landscape, hills and valleys of refuse that seemed impossible to address through conventional means. King Augean met him at the entrance, his face a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Many heroes have looked at this task and walked away," he said, gesturing toward the vast expanse of soiled ground. "The work would take 1,000 men 1,000 days, and even then." He shrugged helplessly. But Heracles had learned something from his previous labors about the power of patient observation and creative thinking. Instead of immediately rolling up his sleeves, he spent the first day simply walking the perimeter of the stables, studying not just the problem but the landscape itself. He noticed the 2 rivers that flowed past the valley, the Alpheus and the Peneus, and began to see possibilities where others had seen only obstacles. "Sometimes," he murmured to himself as he watched the clear water rushing past, "the solution to overwhelming problems is not to work harder, but to work more thoughtfully. Nature herself provides the tools, if we have the wisdom to see them and the humility to ask for help." That evening, he sat with the local farmers and engineers, not as a hero commanding their assistance, but as a collaborator seeking their wisdom. "I have an idea," he said gently, "but I will need your knowledge of these lands and your help to make it work. This task is too great for any one person, no matter how strong." Together, they developed a plan that was breathtaking in its simplicity and ambition. By creating a series of carefully placed channels and temporary dams, they could redirect portions of both rivers through the stables, using the power of flowing water to accomplish in a single day what would have taken years of manual labor. The work began before dawn, with Heracles using his great strength not to shovel waste, but to move enormous stones into precisely calculated positions. The farmers and engineers guided the technical aspects, their knowledge of water flow and land management proving as valuable as any supernatural strength. It was a symphony of collaboration, each person contributing their unique gifts to the shared goal. When the dams were opened and the rivers redirected, the result was magnificent. The rushing water swept through the stables like a great cleansing breath, carrying away decades of accumulation, revealing the original beauty of the land beneath. But more than just cleaning, the water deposited rich sediment in the surrounding fields, transforming what had been waste into the foundation for future fertility. By evening, the stables gleamed in the setting sun, and the fields around them were dark with rich, river-deposited soil. The farmers stood amazed, not just at the cleanliness, but at the transformation of their land from liability to asset. "The best harvest in generations will grow here," one old farmer said, running the dark earth through his fingers. As the rivers were carefully guided back to their original channels, Heracles reflected on the day's deeper lessons. Sometimes the most overwhelming problems required not brute force, but creative thinking and collaborative effort. Sometimes what appeared to be waste could be transformed into the foundation for new growth. And sometimes the greatest strength lay not in working alone, but in recognizing when to ask for help and how to bring together different kinds of expertise. King Augean, initially amazed by the transformation, later refused to honor his promise of payment, claiming that Heracles had used trickery rather than honest labor. But Heracles felt no anger at this betrayal. The true reward had been the lesson itself, and the sight of clear streams flowing where stagnation had reigned, and the knowledge that sometimes the most elegant solutions were those that worked with natural forces rather than against them. That night, as he camped by the restored stables, Heracles listened to the gentle sounds of contented cattle and flowing water, understanding that he had learned something profound about the art of renewal and the power of approaching problems with fresh eyes and an open heart. The lake of Stymphalian lay like a mirror beneath the morning mist, its surface so still that it reflected the surrounding mountains with perfect clarity. But this tranquility was deceptive, for in the dense reeds and ancient trees that bordered the water lived creatures that had turned this peaceful place into a realm of fear. The bronze-winged birds were not evil, but they had grown wild and aggressive, their numbers so great that their presence overwhelmed the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Heracles stood at the lake's edge, watching the first rays of sunlight penetrate the mist, and found himself thinking about balance. His previous labors had taught him that problems often stemmed not from inherent evil, but from imbalance. Too much of even a good thing could become destructive. The birds were magnificent creatures, their bronze feathers catching the light like living metal, their calls hauntingly beautiful when heard individually. But together, in such numbers, their presence had become overwhelming. As if summoned by his thoughts, a great rustling began in the trees, and the birds began to emerge. Hundreds of them, then thousands, their wings creating a sound like distant thunder, their bronze feathers flashing in the strengthening sunday. They filled the air above the lake in a great swirling cloud, and Heracles could see both their beauty and their destructiveness, the way their sharp feathers fell like dangerous rain, the way their sheer numbers blocked out the Sunday. But instead of reaching for weapons, Heracles found himself remembering the gift that Athena had given him for this task, bronze castanets crafted by Hephaestus himself. The goddess had not provided him with instruments of destruction, but with tools of creation, of music. Sometimes he could almost hear her voice on the wind. The solution to chaos is not more chaos, but the introduction of purposeful harmony. Heracles began to play the castanets, slowly at first, finding their rhythm, their voice. The sound was clear and bright, cutting through the cacophony of bird calls like a thread of silver light. The bronze instruments seemed to speak directly to the bronze-feathered birds, and gradually, incredibly, the chaotic swirling began to take on a pattern. As he played, Heracles found himself thinking not of driving the birds away, but of guiding them toward a new understanding of their place in the world. The rhythm of the castanets became a kind of conversation, a musical negotiation between human intention and wild instinct. Slowly, majestically, the great flock began to organize itself, individual birds finding their place within larger patterns, chaos transforming into a dance of incredible beauty. The music seemed to awaken something deep within the birds' collective consciousness, a memory of migration, of seasons, of the ancient rhythms that had once guided their ancestors across vast distances. As the sun climbed higher, the great flock began to move, not fleeing in fear but departing in purpose, their formation a masterpiece of natural coordination. Some flew north, toward mountains where their presence would disturb no human settlements. Others headed south, toward islands where they could live freely without overwhelming any single ecosystem. A few remained, but in numbers that brought life to the lake rather than dominating it. The balance that had been lost was gently restored, not through destruction, but through the power of harmony to organize chaos into beauty. As the last of the migrating flocks disappeared into the distance, their bronze feathers glinting like stars in the bright sky, Heracles lowered the castanets and stood in the restored silence. The lake was peaceful again, but it was a richer peace than before, enhanced by the presence of just enough wildness to keep it alive and vital. A few of the remaining birds landed near him, no longer aggressive but curious, their bronze feathers rustling softly as they studied this human who had spoken to them in the universal language of rhythm and respect. One particularly bold bird stepped close enough for him to see his reflection in its bright, intelligent eyes, and he saw there not fear but recognition, one conscious being acknowledging another. That evening, as Heracles prepared to leave the now peaceful lake, he reflected on the day's profound teaching. Sometimes the solution to overwhelming problems was not force, but the patient application of harmony. Sometimes what seemed like destruction was actually a natural process seeking better organization. And sometimes the greatest strength lay in knowing when to create rather than destroy, when to guide rather than conquer, when to make music rather than war. The bronze castanets lay quiet in his hands, but their lesson resonated in his heart. In a world that often seemed chaotic and overwhelming, the power to create harmony, whether through music, through patience, or through understanding, was perhaps the greatest gift of all. The island of Crete rose from the wine, dark sea like a jewel, its white cliffs gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, its olive groves and vineyards speaking of ancient abundance. But as Heracles' ship approached the harbor, he could see the signs of distress, withered crops, damaged buildings, and a strange electric tension in the air itself, as if the very island were holding its breath. King Minos met him at the dock, his face lined with worry and exhaustion. The bull was Poseidon's gift, he explained as they walked toward the palace. Beautiful beyond description, white as sea foam, strong as the earthquake itself. But my pride, my refusal to honor the god as promised, has transformed blessing into curse. The bull runs wild now, and with it runs the fury of the sea itself. Heracles listened with the patience he had learned from his previous labors, understanding that this story was about more than just a rampaging animal. It was about the relationship between humans and the forces of nature, about promises broken and the consequences that rippled out like waves from stones dropped in still water. The bull, he sensed, was not the problem but the symptom of a deeper imbalance. They found the creature on a hilltop overlooking the sea, and Heracles caught his breath at its magnificence. It was indeed beautiful beyond words, its hide white as polished marble, its horns gleaming like ivory, its eyes holding depths of power that spoke of divine origins. But there was wildness there too, a fury born not of evil but of betrayal, of sacred trust violated. As the bull pawed the earth and snorted, Heracles felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, not with the creature's physical power, but with something deeper. This was Poseidon's bull, born of the sea's power, embodying the raw force of tides and storms and the deep currents that connected all things. To approach it with aggression would be to fight the ocean itself. Instead, Heracles sat down on a nearby rock, allowing his breathing to slow, his heartbeat to match the rhythm of the waves far below. He had learned from the Stymphalian birds about the power of harmony, and now he sought to find the frequency that would resonate with this magnificent creature's true nature. Closing his eyes, he listened not just with his ears, but with his entire being, seeking to understand the song of wind and wave that lived within the bull's divine essence. Gradually, incredibly, the bull's snorting and stamping began to quiet. Its breathing slowed to match Heracles' own, and the electric tension in the air began to dissipate. When Heracles finally opened his eyes, the creature was watching him with something like curiosity, its divine intelligence recognizing something familiar in this human who approached with respect rather than domination. "Great One," Heracles said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I know what it is to be given power and then to feel betrayed by those who should have honored that gift. I know what it is to rage against the consequences of others' broken promises. But perhaps together we can find a way to transform this anger into something more healing." Slowly, carefully, Heracles approached the bull, his movements deliberate and respectful. The creature allowed him to come near, to place his hands on its neck, to feel the power that thrummed beneath its divine hide. In that contact, Heracles felt the bull's story, the joy of its creation, the pride in its perfection, the pain of being refused, the honor that had been promised, the loneliness of divine power without divine purpose. "Come," Heracles whispered, his hands gentle on the bull's neck. "Let me help you find your way back to the sea, back to your true home. King Minos's failure need not define your destiny. There are other shores, other places where your power will be honored rather than feared." The journey to the mainland was unlike any voyage Heracles had ever taken. The bull stood calm and magnificent at the ship's prow, its presence transforming the vessel into something magical. Dolphins appeared to escort them, and the sea itself seemed to calm in honor of Poseidon's creature returning to the realm where it truly belonged. When they reached the shores of Tiryns, Heracles led the bull to a sacred grove overlooking the sea, a place where it could run free without bringing harm to human settlements, where its divine nature could be honored rather than feared. As he released the creature, the bull turned back once, its eyes holding what seemed like gratitude, before disappearing into the grove where it would live as both wild and sacred, free and blessed. King Eurystheus, expecting to receive the bull as a trophy, was initially disappointed by Heracles' decision to release it. But Heracles had learned that some gifts from the gods were meant to remain free, that true strength sometimes meant knowing when not to capture but to liberate, when not to possess but to honor. The lesson of the Cretan bull was perhaps the most profound, yet that divine power, once released into the world, must be treated with the respect it deserves, and that healing sometimes comes not from controlling natural forces, but from helping them find their proper place in the grand design. Years later, sailors would report glimpses of a magnificent white bull running along remote coastlines, always near the sea, a reminder that some beauties are meant to remain wild, some powers meant to flow freely, some gifts from the gods meant to inspire rather than be possessed. The kingdom of Diomedes lay under heavy clouds, and as Heracles approached the royal stables, he could hear sounds that chilled the soul, not the gentle nickering of horses, but something wilder, more primal. These were the man-eating mares, 4 creatures whose beauty had been twisted by their master's cruelty into something terrible. Their names were whispered in fear: Podargos the swift, Lampon the shining, Xanthos the yellow, and Dinos the terrible. King Diomedes himself was a man whose heart had grown as wild as his horses, feeding them on human flesh until they had forgotten their gentle nature entirely. But as Heracles observed from a distance, he saw something that others had missed. Beneath their fearsome behavior, these creatures carried a deep sadness, a longing for the natural peace that had been denied them. Unlike his previous labors, this task seemed to demand confrontation with genuine evil, not misunderstood wildness or natural imbalance, but the deliberate corruption of innocent creatures. Yet even here, Heracles had learned to look beyond the surface, to seek the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. He began by watching the mares from afar, studying their patterns, their interactions with each other. Despite their fearsome reputation, he noticed moments of tenderness between them, gentle nuzzling, protective positioning when they sensed danger, small signs that their original nature had not been entirely destroyed. They were still horses at heart, still creatures capable of love and trust, even if those qualities had been buried beneath layers of abuse and unnatural feeding. Heracles' plan was as audacious as it was compassionate. Instead of fighting the mares or their master separately, he would use Diomedes himself to begin the process of their healing. The king who had perverted their nature would become the key to their restoration, not through his cruelty, but through the natural consequences of his actions. The confrontation, when it came, was swift, but not without purpose. Diomedes, expecting to feed this new hero to his beloved mares, instead found himself facing the very creatures he had corrupted. But in their final meeting with their master, something extraordinary happened. Presented with the source of their corruption, the mares seemed to recognize the unnaturalness of their situation. Their attack on Diomedes was brief, almost ritualistic, as if they were cleansing themselves of his influence rather than simply feeding. In the silence that followed, Heracles approached the mares slowly, his hands empty, his voice soft. "Beautiful ones," he called gently, "you have been made to do terrible things, but that was not your choice. You are horses, meant to run with the wind, to feel grass beneath your hooves, to know kindness from human hands. Will you let me help you remember who you truly are? The transformation was not immediate healing, never is when the wounds run deep. For days, Heracles remained with the mares, speaking softly to them, offering them clean water and sweet grass, never forcing contact but always offering it. Slowly, gradually, their fierce expressions began to soften. Podargos was the first to approach, her swift feet carrying her in cautious circles around this human who offered food without demands, kindness without cruelty. One by one, the other mares began to trust. Lampon's shine returned as her coat grew healthy under proper care. Xanthos's yellow mane began to gleam like sunlight instead of seeming dull with despair. Even Dinos, the most damaged, began to show signs of her original gentle nature, allowing Heracles to touch her neck, to whisper promises of better days to come. The journey back to Tiryns became a pilgrimage of healing. Each day, the mares grew more trusting, more willing to remember their true nature. They learned to eat grass again, to drink clear water, to respond to gentle words instead of harsh commands. Other travelers, seeing this strange procession of the hero and his gentle horses, were amazed at the transformation. When they finally reached King Eurystheus, the mares were magnificent again, powerful but peaceful, beautiful and no longer terrible. The king, expecting monsters, found himself faced with 4 of the most beautiful horses he had ever seen. But Heracles knew that their healing was not complete, that they deserved better than to become mere royal property. "These creatures have suffered enough captivity," he told the king gently. "They have remembered their true nature, but they need freedom to complete their healing. Let them run wild on the hills above the city, where they can be horses again, truly and completely." And so the mares of Diomedes found their freedom, running together across the hillsides, their hooves drumming a rhythm of joy against the earth. Sometimes travelers would catch glimpses of them, 4 magnificent creatures, racing the wind, their manes streaming like banners of triumph over adversity. The lesson of the mares was perhaps the most hopeful of all Heracles' labors, that even creatures damaged by cruelty could be healed through patient love, that corruption was not permanent, that the deepest nature of any living being was goodness, waiting to be remembered and restored. The land of the Amazons lay beyond the eastern horizon, where the sun rose each morning from waters so blue they seemed to hold pieces of the sky itself. As Heracles' ship approached their shores, he found himself thinking not of conquest, but of conversation, not of battle, but of the possibility of understanding between different ways of life. The girdle of Queen Hippolyta was said to be a symbol of her divine authority, given to her by Ares himself, but Heracles had begun to suspect that this labor, like the others, would teach him something unexpected about the nature of true strength. The Amazon city was unlike anything he had ever seen, a place where strength and beauty existed in perfect harmony, where warrior women moved with the fluid grace of dancers and the focused power of seasoned fighters. The architecture itself seemed to embody their values: strong but elegant, practical but beautiful, defensive but not closed off from the world. Queen Hippolyta received him in her great hall, and Heracles was struck by her presence, not the fierce antagonist he had been expecting, but a leader whose strength was tempered by wisdom, whose power was enhanced rather than diminished by her capacity for thoughtfulness. She sat upon her throne with natural authority, the golden girdle around her waist catching the light like captured sunbeams, her eyes holding depths of experience and understanding. "Heracles," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "your reputation travels ahead of you, not just as a warrior, but as one who seeks to understand rather than simply to conquer. Tell me, what brings the great hero to our shores? What is it that you truly seek here?" The conversation that followed was unlike any negotiation in the stories of heroes that had come before. Instead of demands and challenges, there was genuine curiosity on both sides. Heracles spoke of his labors not as conquests but as lessons, sharing what he had learned about patience from the Hind, about collaboration from the Augean stables, about healing from the mares of Diomedes. Hippolyta listened with growing interest, recognizing in this hero something different from the tales of masculine conquest that usually reached her shores. "You seek my girdle," she said finally, "but not, I think, as a trophy to be taken by force. Tell me, what would you do with this symbol of Amazon authority if I were to give it to you?" Heracles considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would reveal the true nature of his quest. "Great Queen," he said slowly, "I have come to understand that my labors are not about collecting objects, but about learning lessons. If you were to honor me with your girdle, I would wear it not as a sign of conquest, but as a reminder that true strength comes not from domination, but from the willingness to approach others with respect and openness to learning." The Amazon Queen smiled, and in that smile was both approval and recognition. "You understand something that many heroes miss," she said, rising from her throne. "Power is not diminished when it is shared willingly, but enhanced. A gift freely given creates bonds stronger than any chain forged in conquest." She unbuckled the golden girdle with ceremonial slowness, each movement deliberate and meaningful. "This was given to me by Ares as a symbol of the strength that comes from knowing oneself, from standing firm in one's principles while remaining open to growth. I give it to you now because you have shown me that strength can be gentle, that power can be humble, that a true hero seeks not to diminish others but to learn from them." As Hippolyta placed the girdle in his hands, Heracles felt its weight, not the physical weight of gold and precious stones, but the spiritual weight of responsibility and trust. This was not a trophy taken in battle, but a sacred trust given in recognition of growth and understanding. The ceremony that followed was one of mutual honor. The Amazons celebrated not a conquered hero, but a respected visitor, sharing their customs, their stories, their wisdom about the balance between strength and compassion. Heracles, in turn, shared his own experiences, his struggles with anger and redemption, his growing understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. But the peaceful exchange was not to last unchanged. Hera, ever jealous of Heracles' growing wisdom and the ease with which he was completing his labors, disguised herself among the Amazons and spread rumors that the hero had come to kidnap their queen. The resulting confusion led to conflict, and in the chaos that followed, the very understanding that had been built between cultures was temporarily shattered. Yet even in this moment of misunderstanding and violence, the lesson of the girdle held true. Hippolyta's final words, spoken as she lay dying from wounds received in the confused battle, were words of forgiveness and hope. Do not let this tragedy erase what we learned from each other. Carry the girdle not as a memorial to conflict, but as a promise of the understanding that is possible between different peoples when they approach each other with open hearts. Heracles left the Amazon shores, carrying more than the golden girdle. He carried the memory of what could be achieved through respectful dialogue and mutual recognition. The tragic ending could not diminish the powerful beginning, the proof that strength and wisdom could indeed bridge any divide when given the chance to flourish. The girdle became, in the end, exactly what Hippolyta had intended, not a symbol of conquest, but a reminder of the possibility of understanding, a golden thread connecting different ways of being strong, different approaches to power, different visions of what it meant to be heroic in an often challenging world. At the edge of the known world, where the sun set each evening into waters that seemed to stretch into infinity, lay the island of Erythea. Here dwelt Geryon, the three-bodied giant, guardian of a herd of red cattle so beautiful they were said to embody the sunset itself. But as Heracles stood at the Pillars of Hercules, looking out across the wine-dark sea toward this distant isle, he understood that this labor would be about more than retrieving cattle. It would be about the long journey back to understanding himself. The journey to Erythea was itself a meditation on distance and time. Helios, the sun god, had lent Heracles his golden cup to cross the vast waters, and as the hero sailed through the endless blue, he found himself reflecting on how far he had traveled, not just in physical distance, but in understanding. The man who had begun these labors in anguish and self-hatred had gradually learned patience, compassion, wisdom, and the true nature of strength. Geryon's island was a place of ancient power, where time moved differently and the light itself seemed touched with magic. The cattle that grazed in the perpetual sunset were indeed magnificent, their red hides seeming to glow with inner fire, their movements graceful as dancers, their eyes holding depths of wisdom that spoke of divine origins. They were guarded not just by the three-bodied giant, but by Orthrus, the two-headed hound, brother to Cerberus himself. When Heracles finally encountered Geryon, he found not the mindless monster he had expected, but a being of profound sadness and loneliness. The giant's three bodies allowed him to see from many perspectives simultaneously, but this gift had become a curse. He experienced reality as a constant confusion of viewpoints, unable to find peace or unity within himself. His cattle were not just possessions, but companions, the only beings who seemed to accept his strange nature without fear or judgment. "Great Geryon," Heracles called across the twilight pasture, "I have come for your cattle, but I see now that they are more to you than mere possessions. They are your family, your peace, your connection to harmony in a world that sees you as monstrous. How can I ask you to give up what brings you comfort?" The giant's three heads turned toward him in unison, and for a moment all three faces showed the same expression of surprise and gratitude. Finally, someone who saw him as more than just an obstacle to overcome. "You understand?" Geryon said, his voice harmonizing strangely as all three mouths spoke together. "But these cattle, they are not truly mine to keep forever. They belong to the world, to the cycle of sunset and sunrise, to the great dance of light and shadow. Perhaps it is time for them to continue their journey." What followed was not a battle, but a ceremony, a ritual passing of guardianship from one lonely keeper to another who had learned the responsibility that came with caring for sacred things. Even Orthrus, the fearsome hound, seemed to understand that this was not conquest, but transition, allowing Heracles to approach with only a warning growl rather than an attack. The journey home with the cattle was the longest and most challenging part of the entire labor. Across the Mediterranean, through Gaul, over the Alps, down through Italy, everywhere they went, the red cattle drew attention, wonder, and sometimes attempted theft. But Heracles had learned patience from the Hind, persistence from the Hydra, and gentle strength from the mares, and he applied all these lessons to the task of protecting his charges while leading them safely home. Along the way, the cattle themselves taught him final lessons about leadership and responsibility. They trusted him completely, following where he led, but they also had their own wisdom about where to graze, where to rest, how to move as a unified herd while still maintaining their individual nature. Heracles learned to listen to their needs, to balance his human knowledge with their animal wisdom, to be both guide and servant to those in his care. There were challenges, river crossings that required careful planning, mountain passes that tested endurance, encounters with bandits who saw the magnificent herd as an opportunity for easy wealth. But each obstacle became another opportunity to apply the lessons of previous labors, to choose understanding over force, patience over haste, protection over destruction. When they finally reached the familiar hills above Tiryns, Heracles realized that the cattle had become more than a labor to complete. They had become a symbol of everything he had learned about responsibility, about caring for others, about the long journey of growth and understanding. King Eurystheus, expecting to receive the herd as a sign of conquest, instead found himself faced with a hero who had learned that true victory was not in taking, but in protecting, not in conquering, but in nurturing. As the red cattle were released into the royal pastures where they would be honored rather than exploited, Heracles reflected on the profound circularity of his journey. He had traveled to the edge of the world and back again, but the longest journey had been the one within himself, from anger to understanding, from isolation to connection, from strength used destructively to strength used to protect and nurture. The cattle of Geryon, grazing peacefully in their new home, served as a daily reminder that some journeys take us far from home, only to help us understand what home truly means, and that sometimes the most precious things we can bring back from our adventures are the lessons we learn about our own capacity for growth, compassion, and wisdom. Beyond the western ocean, where the sun laid down its golden head each night to rest, lay a garden that existed at the very edge of the world and at the center of all seeking. The garden of the Hesperides was said to contain a tree bearing apples of pure gold, fruit that embodied the essence of immortality itself. But as Heracles began this penultimate labor, he sensed that these apples represented something far more profound than mere objects to be retrieved. They were symbols of the wisdom that comes only at the end of a long journey of self-discovery. The first challenge was simply finding the garden, for it existed not in any fixed location but wherever the seeker had grown wise enough to perceive it. Heracles wandered for months, following rumors and half-remembered legends, consulting with ancient spirits and wise oracles. But each dead end taught him patience. Each false lead deepened his understanding that this quest was as much about the searching as it was about the finding. His journey led him first to the old man of the sea, Nereus, who could assume any shape but could not escape from one who held him with both strength and gentleness. From Nereus, Heracles learned not the location of the garden, but the first lesson about seeking, that truth often hides behind many disguises, and only those who can hold steady through constant change will ultimately find what they seek. The path then took him to the Caucasus, where Prometheus hung in eternal punishment for bringing fire to humanity. Here was suffering that Heracles could alleviate, and in freeing the Titan from his bonds and his torment, the hero learned something crucial about the nature of redemption. Sometimes we find what we seek not by pursuing it directly, but by stopping to help others along the way. Prometheus, grateful for his freedom, gave Heracles the guidance he needed. The garden lies not at the destination of your journey, but at the understanding that you have been walking through it all along. Finally, the path led to Atlas, the great Titan who held up the sky itself, his mighty shoulders bearing the weight of the heavens for all eternity. Here was strength even greater than Heracles' own, but it was strength trapped by duty, power imprisoned by responsibility. The golden apples grew in Atlas's own garden, tended by his daughters, the Hesperides, but he could not leave his post to retrieve them himself. "Great Atlas," Heracles said, approaching with the respect he had learned to show all beings struggling with their burdens. "I have come seeking the golden apples, but I see that you carry a weight far greater than any I have known. If I were to take your burden temporarily, would you be willing to retrieve the apples for me? Not as servant to master, but as one who understands responsibility helping another." The offer was unprecedented. No mortal had ever volunteered to hold up the sky, and Atlas looked at Heracles with something like wonder. Slowly, carefully, the great Titan began to shift his burden, and Heracles felt the weight of the entire universe settle onto his shoulders. It was crushing, overwhelming, a responsibility that seemed to press down not just on his body but on his very soul. But in that moment of ultimate burden, Heracles experienced something extraordinary. Holding up the sky, he felt connected to every star, every planet, every distant Sunday. The weight was immense, but so was the privilege to be the point of support for all existence, to be trusted with the continuation of everything that was and would ever be. For the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of strength, not the power to destroy or conquer, but the ability to support and sustain. Atlas, meanwhile, walked with wonder toward his daughter's garden, his steps light and joyful after eons of immobility. The Hesperides' evening, sunset, and dusk welcomed their father with songs of celebration, their voices like the music of twilight itself. Together, they selected 3 perfect golden apples, each one containing the light of countless sunsets, the wisdom of patient growth, the promise of renewal that comes at the end of every cycle. When Atlas returned carrying the precious fruit, he found Heracles changed by his experience of bearing the sky. The hero's face held new depths of understanding, new appreciation for the weight that others carried, new compassion for all beings struggling with their own particular burdens. The exchange of the sky back to its proper bearer was gentle, respectful, filled with mutual recognition of shared responsibility. "These apples," Atlas said as he handed them over, "are not prizes to be won but gifts to be received. They represent the golden fruit of a life lived with purpose, the sweetness that comes from bearing our burdens with dignity, the immortality that we achieve not through living forever, but through living fully in each moment." As Heracles began his journey home, carrying the golden apples with infinite care, he realized that the true treasure he had found was not the fruit itself, but the understanding he had gained about the interconnectedness of all things, about the privilege of responsibility, about the golden light that shines in every moment when we approach life with wisdom and compassion. The garden of the Hesperides, he now knew, had never been a distant place to be found, but a state of being to be achieved. The recognition that everywhere we go, if we approach it with the right understanding, can be paradise, can be the garden at the end of seeking, can be home. The final labor called Heracles to descend into the very depths of existence itself, to the shadowy realm of Hades where the spirits of the departed dwelt in eternal twilight. His task was to bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates of the underworld, but as he stood at the entrance to that dark realm, Heracles understood that this descent would be the culmination of all his learning, the final test of everything he had become through his long journey of transformation. The path downward was not the terrifying descent he had imagined, but rather a gradual transition from the familiar world of sunlight and solid ground to something more mysterious and profound. As he walked deeper into the earth, Heracles felt himself moving not just through physical space, but through layers of understanding, each step taking him closer to the fundamental truths that lay beneath the surface of everyday existence. The underworld was not the place of torment he had expected, but rather a realm of deep stillness, where the noise and urgency of the upper world gave way to contemplation and reflection. Here, the spirits of the dead moved with the peaceful slowness of those who had laid down the burdens of physical existence, their forms translucent and serene, their eyes holding the wisdom that comes only from having completed the journey of life. Hades himself received Heracles with neither hostility nor welcome, but with the neutral dignity of one who understands the necessity of all visitors to his realm. Persephone sat beside him, her face holding both the sorrow of separation from the upper world and the deep contentment of one who has found her place in the great cycle of seasons and souls. "Heracles," Hades said, his voice carrying the weight of eons and the gentleness of final understanding. "You have come for my hound, but tell me, why should the guardian of death's door leave his post? Cerberus serves a purpose here that goes beyond mere obedience to your king's commands. What would you offer in exchange for such a profound disruption of the natural order?" The question pierced to the heart of everything Heracles had learned during his labors. He had gained wisdom about the interconnectedness of all things, the importance of balance, the necessity of approaching every being and situation with respect and understanding. Now he had to apply all these lessons to the ultimate challenge, asking for something that seemed to violate the very order of existence itself. "Lord Hades," Heracles replied after long contemplation, "I have learned that true strength lies not in taking what we want, but in understanding what we need. I ask not to permanently remove Cerberus from his duty, but to borrow him temporarily, to learn from him, to understand what he teaches about the boundaries between life and death, between fear and acceptance. And I offer myself as guarantee if I fail to treat him with the respect he deserves, if I fail to return him safely to his post, then I will remain here in his place, serving as guardian myself. Hades considered this offer with the slow thoughtfulness of eternity, while Persephone's eyes showed a growing interest in this hero who approached the most fundamental mysteries with such humility and respect. Finally, the Lord of the Dead nodded slowly. Your offer shows wisdom, but I will not hold you to such an extreme bond. Instead, I ask this: approach Cerberus without weapons, without force, without any tool except understanding. If he accepts you, if he chooses to go with you, then take him with my blessing. But if he refuses, accept that refusal with grace and seek another way to complete your labors. The great hound was even more magnificent than the stories had described. Each of his 3 heads was the size of a lion's. His eyes burned like coals in the darkness, and his massive body blocked the gateway between life and death like a living mountain. But as Heracles approached without aggression, without demands, without any intention except to understand, he saw something in those burning eyes that transformed his perception entirely. Cerberus was not a monster, but a guardian in the truest sense, a being whose fierce appearance masked a profound devotion to duty and a deep compassion for all who must pass through the gates he protected. His 3 heads allowed him to see past, present, and future simultaneously, to understand the full journey of every soul that approached, to judge with perfect wisdom who belonged in the realm of the dead and who still had work to do in the world above. Great guardian, Heracles said softly, settling himself cross-legged before the massive hound, I have come seeking understanding more than victory, wisdom more than triumph. You have watched over the greatest mystery of all, the passage between life and death, between known and unknown. What can you teach me about the courage it takes to face the ultimate boundary? For long moments, the 3 heads studied Heracles with their burning eyes, and gradually something shifted in their expressions. The middle head, which saw the present moment with perfect clarity, began to pant slightly, as if recognizing something familiar in this human who sat without fear in the presence of death itself. The left head, which saw the past, seemed to nod with recognition of Heracles' long journey of transformation. The right head, which saw the future, tilted slightly as if seeing possibilities that pleased it. Slowly, majestically, Cerberus lay down, his great heads lowering until they were level with Heracles' own. In that gesture was acceptance, recognition, and something like friendship. The hound was not submitting to force, but choosing to trust, offering himself as teacher rather than opponent. Will you come with me, Great One? Heracles asked gently, reaching out to touch the smooth fur of the central head. Not as captive, but as companion, not as trophy, but as teacher. I promise to learn from you, to treat you with honor, and to bring you home safely to your important work. Cerberus rose slowly, his massive form moving with surprising grace, and stepped away from the gates for the first time in eons. The journey upward was unlike any other Heracles had taken. Instead of traveling alone with his thoughts, he found himself in constant dialogue with the three-headed guardian, learning about the nature of endings and beginnings, about the courage required to face the unknown, about the peace that comes from accepting rather than fighting the natural cycles of existence. When they emerged into sunlight, Cerberus paused, his three heads lifting to feel the warmth of the sun he had not experienced in countless ages. For a moment, the great guardian seemed to smile, an expression of such joy and wonder that it transformed his fearsome features into something beautiful. The presentation to King Eurystheus was brief and dignified. The terrified king, seeing the massive hound who embodied the mystery of death itself, quickly agreed that the labor was complete and begged Heracles to return the creature to its proper realm as quickly as possible. But for Heracles, the real completion came not in this moment of official recognition, but in the journey back to the underworld, where Cerberus taught him final lessons about duty, about finding joy in service, about the honor that comes from guarding what is precious and sacred. At the gates of death, the great hound turned back once more to regard Heracles with those burning eyes that saw all times and all truths. In that final gaze was gratitude, recognition, and a blessing that would accompany the hero for the rest of his days. Then Cerberus resumed his eternal watch, but now with the knowledge that somewhere in the world above was a human who understood the sacred nature of his duty, who honored the necessity of boundaries, and who had learned that true courage lay not in conquering death, but in accepting it as part of the greater mystery of existence. The 12 labors were complete, but as Heracles stood once again beneath the ancient olive tree where his journey had begun, he understood that completion was not an ending, but a transformation. The man who had started these tasks in anguish and self-hatred had become someone else entirely, not through the destruction of his former self, but through the patient cultivation of wisdom, compassion, and understanding. King Eurystheus, reviewing the completed labors, had expected to receive a collection of trophies, proof of conquest and domination. Instead, he found himself confronted with stories of collaboration, transformation, and respect for all living things. The lion's hide that Heracles wore was not a symbol of victory over fear, but a reminder of the dignity that could be found even in necessary endings. The knowledge he carried of the Hydra's transformation spoke not of destruction, but of the patient work of healing chaotic thoughts into focused wisdom. Each labor had been a teacher, each challenge an opportunity to practice the art of approaching the world with an open heart and a curious mind. The Hind had taught patience and the ability to appreciate beauty without possessing it. The Boar had shown the power of gentle redirection over violent confrontation. The Augean stables had revealed the magic of collaboration and creative thinking. The Stymphalian birds had demonstrated how harmony could organize chaos into beauty. The Cretan bull had shown the importance of helping divine power find its proper place in the world. The mares of Diomedes had proven that even the most damaged beings could be healed through patient love and understanding. Hippolyta's girdle represented the strength that came from recognizing and honoring the wisdom of others. The cattle of Geryon had taught the responsibility that came with protecting and nurturing what was precious. The golden apples of the Hesperides had revealed that the greatest treasures were often found not at the destination, but in the understanding gained along the journey. And Cerberus had shown that even the most fearsome guardians of life's greatest mysteries could become teachers and friends when approached with respect and openness. As the sun set on that final day, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Heracles reflected on the profound circularity of his journey. He had traveled to the edges of the known world and beyond, had faced creatures of legend and beings of divine power, had descended even to the realm of the dead itself. But the longest journey had been the one within himself, from anger to understanding, from isolation to connection, from strength used destructively to strength used to protect and nurture all life. The curse that had driven him to these labors, the madness sent by jealous Hera, had been transformed through his journey into something like a gift. What had begun as punishment had become education. What had started as penance had evolved into a pilgrimage of the soul. The gods themselves seemed to recognize this transformation, for the weight of divine anger that had pressed upon him for so long had lifted like morning mist before the rising Sunday. In the years that followed, Heracles became known not as a warrior or a conqueror, but as a teacher and a protector. Young heroes would seek him out, asking for lessons in strength and courage, but they would learn instead about patience and compassion, about the art of approaching challenges with creativity rather than force, about the deep satisfaction that came from helping others rather than defeating them. His fame spread not through tales of battles won, but through stories of problems solved peacefully, of communities healed, of conflicts resolved through understanding rather than violence. People began to speak of Herculean efforts, not as displays of overwhelming force, but as examples of patient, persistent work done with love and wisdom for the good of all. And sometimes, in the evening light, travelers would report seeing a figure walking the ancient paths, a man of great strength, moving with surprising gentleness, accompanied sometimes by the spirits of all the creatures he had learned from during his great journey of transformation. The lion walked beside him as a friend, The Hydra's many voices harmonized in song. The Hind danced just ahead of his footsteps, and even the great Cerberus could occasionally be seen, his three heads no longer fearsome but wise, his eyes holding depths of understanding about the great mysteries of existence. These sightings became legends themselves, stories told around fires on quiet evenings, reminders that the greatest adventures were not about conquering the external world, but about discovering the infinite possibilities for growth and compassion that lived within each human heart. And those who heard these stories would go to sleep feeling somehow more hopeful, more connected to the great web of existence that joined all living things in one magnificent, ever-unfolding story of learning to love more deeply and live more wisely. The 12 Labors of Heracles became, in the end, not just the story of one hero's journey, but a template for anyone seeking to transform their own struggles into wisdom, their own challenges into opportunities for growth, their own strength into a force for healing and protection in a world that so desperately needed both. And in quiet moments, when the work of transformation felt difficult or uncertain, people would remember the great hero who had learned that true strength lay not in what we could destroy, but in what we could heal, protect, and nurture into its fullest flowering. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had witnessed Heracles' journey from anger to understanding, from isolation to connection, from despair to hope. And somewhere in their eternal light was the promise that every ending was also a beginning, every completion was also a commencement, every labor accomplished was also an invitation to begin the next phase of the great work of becoming fully, beautifully, completely human. In the gentle darkness that follows the setting of the sun and precedes the rising of the moon, the story comes to rest, like a bird settling into its nest after a long day of flight. The tale of Heracles and his 12 labors joins the great river of stories that flow through human consciousness, carrying within their currents the eternal truths about courage and compassion, strength and gentleness, the long journey we all must take from who we are to who we might become. And so we close this gentle chronicle of transformation, this bedtime story for grown-ups who still believe in the possibility of change, still hope for the strength to face their own labors with wisdom and love. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams be filled with the courage of the gentle hero, and may you wake tomorrow ready to approach your own challenges with the patient strength that comes from understanding that every difficulty is also an opportunity to grow in wisdom and compassion. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers on the long journey home to ourselves. The path is always there, waiting for us to take the next step with courage, with hope, and with the unshakable faith that love, in the end, is always stronger than fear.